Ci siamo. Un brevissimo saluto in italiano, benvenuti a tutti a questa nuova talk del Festival del Giornalismo edizione 2016. A me è soltanto il compito di introdurre brevemente l'ospite di oggi e poi sicuramente ci sarà spazio per alcune domande vostre subito dopo. Parleremo in inglese, ma molti di voi hanno naturalmente la disponibilità della traduzione simultanea. So, welcome everyone. Today, I'm absolutely honored to introduce you to a colleague, a fellow journalist over whose safety and well-being we were worried and also angered for over a year, and who has decided to turn his journalistic wisdom and experience of hardship into a force to be reckoned with. Peter Greste is an award-winning Australian journalist and correspondent. He has worked for Reuters, CNN, BBC, and most recently Al Jazeera English, of course. Since the early 90s, he has reported from London to Bosnia to Mexico, in Africa, in Kenya and Somalia, and has extensively reported from Afghanistan. During his career, he won several important awards for journalism in the US, the UK, and Australia, and most recently, the Human Rights Medal in Sydney. On December 29, 2013, at a time where Egypt had started a methodic, full-blown crackdown on free media and freedom of expression, Peter had been on assignment in Cairo, I believe, for just a few weeks, when he was arrested by Egyptian security, along with his Al Jazeera colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed. They were accused of reporting news that damaged national security and tried on bogus charges. No evidence against them was ever presented by the prosecution during their trial. Despite a strong, amazing international campaign for their release that many of you may remember, after 6 months, on June 23, 2014, they were all found guilty and sentenced, and Peter was sentenced to 7 years in jail. At the beginning of 2015, a retrial was ordered, and in February, Peter was finally deported back to Australia. His colleagues were released on bail. By the day he touched land in Cyprus on his way home as a free man, Peter Greste had spent more than 400 days in a Cairo jail. He has since been a calm, intelligent, obstinate voice on freedom of expression and freedom of the press. We are very happy to have a chance today to say that how happy we are that you are back among us, where you should always have been. And we are eager to hear your thoughts on what is happening to the space where journalists are reporting worldwide, particularly at a time in history where the threat of terrorism is also used as an alibi to shrink that space. Peter Greste.
Thank you. Thanks very much. What an extraordinary hall and an extraordinary place, and a fantastic honor to be here in front of such an overwhelming audience. I'm very, very honored. One of the themes that we've seen come through this past week of this incredible festival has been the way that the world is changing, particularly for journalists and the media. We all know that the world is changing, but the key question, particularly for us, is in what direction? In 2011, President Obama addressed a joint session of the Australian Parliament, and he said that the currents of history may ebb and flow, but over time they move decisively in a single direction. History, he said, is on the side of the free. Free societies, free governments, free economies, and free people. So Democracy 101 tells us that a free press is absolutely central to a free society. That a democracy doesn't work without a press that's capable of interrogating governments, that's capable of keeping track of what governments do in the name of the voters. If that's the case, and freedom does indeed move in a single direction, we ought to be seeing a trend towards greater freedom and diversity. So let's have a look at what the statistics tell us. And this map, I think, is really one of the keys to this. Now, each year, Freedom House does a survey of media freedom around the world, and it puts together a matrix of factors such as government restrictions on the press, official censorship, media laws, concentration of ownership, and so on. Then it draws up a map to give us a sense of what's going on around the world, and this is that map. It's been tracking this over the past few years, since 1995, as you can see. And I want to show you what happens when what's happened to the trends over time. If you have a look, the green areas denote the areas of free press. And that is, of course, across North America, South America in 1995, Australasia, and of course that patch down in the bottom of Africa. The yellow areas are those areas that are deemed to be partly free. Of course, there's Central and parts of Southern America, East Africa, South Asia, and that area up in the former Soviet Union. And then the purple patches are the problem areas. Of course, that's right across the Middle East, Central Asia, China, and down into North Africa and Central Africa. That was in 1995. Let's have a look at what happens the following year. 5 years later, 2000. You can see the way that those green areas have retreated from Africa and Latin America, and the way that the purple has spread further down into Africa and across further even into Europe, parts of Europe, past to Western Europe. 5 years later, in 2005, we have this. There's been a slight fight back for the green areas in Africa, but it doesn't look hugely encouraging. It was brief, but encouraging there. There were signs of improvement. 2010, we see those green areas vanish. The yellow areas stretch across, particularly if you have a look up in Europe, you'll see Eastern and Southern Europe, you'll see those yellow patches extend, and the purple becomes more dominant. And then last year, the situation last year was this. Again, those purple areas getting more and more pervasive, particularly across Africa and in the Middle East. I want to come to the reasons that this happened shortly. But before I do, there's another set of statistics that I'd like us to have a look at. This was put together by the CPJ, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. Now, the CPJ has been tracking the numbers of journalists who've been killed and imprisoned since 1992, and here's how that graph looks. The map up the top deals with the numbers, the overall numbers. The red areas are the places where most journalists have been killed. What I really want to draw your attention to is this graph down the bottom, and in particular the overall shape of the graph. Now, you can see in the early 1990s, there was that hump, and that was when we had very brutal civil wars in Yugoslavia. We saw them in Somalia, Rwanda, and so on. And a lot of those victims, were people that were killed because they were local journalists who were caught up in these very nasty civil conflicts. But then through the late 90s, things eased off a little bit for what now appears to be a relatively safe period for journalists. And then it started to rise again back into the 2000s. And you can see back towards the end there, towards 2016, the numbers have climbed up to the current levels of around 60 or 70 journalists, 60 or 70 of us who are killed each and every year. The turning point, to my mind, the key that I'd like to point out is this one, 2001. That slight blip up there, that slight rise, was largely due to the war in Afghanistan, where we saw quite a number of journalists killed. But then it progressively deteriorated, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. The next map that I'm going to draw your attention to, or the next graph, is this one, journalists in prison, and for obvious reasons, this is something that particularly interests me. Now, what you'll see is the chart on the left, the medium, the charges, and the freelance staff. There's the medium itself is interesting. Well, let's have a look at the overall trends here. Since 2000, the numbers weren't kept before then. They all started, the CPJ started tracking them in 2000, and we've seen it steadily deteriorate until the current levels in 2015. The high point, in case you're wondering, was in 2012 with 232 journalists who were imprisoned, and last year it was 199, almost 200. Let's have a quick look through the pie charts. The one on the left, the medium, that was the number of journalists, just about half, who were from new media, internet journalists, online journalists. Next set was print, a fairly large chunk, followed by TV and then radio. I think this is instructive, and it goes part of the way towards describing what it is that I'm concerned about, and that's because the number of internet journalists that were imprisoned. I think this is because of the way that governments have increasingly been seeing the online reporters as subversive, as a much more serious threat to the established order than the old media. Then we go to the pie chart on the right, freelance and staff. The staff represent the largest chunk, followed by the freelancers. No real surprises there, although it is concerning, obviously, for anybody who continues to hire freelancers. But let's have a look at the one in the middle, the pie chart in the middle. This, excuse me, don't quite where that's come from. Bear with me one moment. That's annoying. Forgive me for this. Don't know quite where that warning's come from. Okay, let's see if we can go back to the chart.
C'è ancora il tecnico che può darci una mano? Ecco che arriva qualcuno.
I don't know quite where that's come from, so it doesn't appear to be. It's still there.
No, mettimi in onda.
Okay, thank you very much. My apologies for that. Okay, so the charges in the middle. This is the one that's obviously concerning me. What we're seeing here is the breakdown of those arrested, those who've been imprisoned, and the kinds of charges that they were under. Now, CPJ says that almost a quarter of them were either charged, arrested without charge, or where the charges had not been disclosed, which I think itself is disturbing. The next chunk, there's a little sliver down the bottom there who were arrested for insulting either religion or ethnic groups. There's another tiny sliver for false news. Then there's this chunk here, which was retaliatory, people who were clearly imprisoned because of the work that they'd done in response or in retaliation for the reporting that they'd done. And then there's this big other chunk, more than half. I guess what this is all about. It's for anti-state charges. These are the journalists who have been imprisoned on charges like sedition, on charges of supporting terrorism, of undermining national security. These are the charges that I and my two colleagues in Egypt were imprisoned under. We were charged, convicted and sentenced, as we've heard, on charges of supporting a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, of financing a terrorist organisation, and of broadcasting false news to undermine national security. So, what's going on here? I think, as we saw earlier, the key issue is the war on terror. It's the way that everything changed after 9/11. You might recall that George W. Bush, after al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center in Washington, George W. Bush declared, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." Now, that remark wasn't aimed specifically at reporters. It was intended as a message to the whole world that you had to take a side. But that remark had profound implications for those of us who work in the media. You all know that we are supposed to be independent. We're supposed to be neutral. We are not supposed to take a particular side. What Bush did was that he effectively made the war on terror a binary choice. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And that took out the safe middle ground that journalists have traditionally been able to occupy. It made it incredibly dangerous for us to start interrogating the work of either the extremists or of the governments and their work on national security without placing yourself in opposition to either side. This is a particularly important issue. What Bush did when he declared the war on terror was turn this into a war over an abstract concept. There was a friend of mine who rather wryly described the war on terror as a war on an abstract noun. It's a war over a set of ideas that are indefinable. They mean whatever anybody wants it to mean. You might recall in the wars of old, and I was speaking a few moments ago about Yugoslavia, that's a fairly typical conflict where you had a war over ethnicity, a war over something that you could fairly clearly define. A lot of the other wars we've seen in Africa have either been over resources, ethnicity, sectarianism, and so on. There have been wars where journalists have been able to get involved with as observers, as neutral, independent observers, not as participants to the conflict. Now, of course, it's always been dangerous. Anybody working on those front lines will know just how risky it can be when you're operating in a place where lumps of metal are flying around at supersonic speeds. But what we haven't seen is a conflict where journalists themselves have been the targets. But here's what's different about the war on terror. It's a war over a set of ideas. And in the war of ideas, the battleground becomes the place where ideas are prosecuted, and that is the media itself. We are the ones, the journalists, who have become the unwitting foot soldiers, the unlisted foot soldiers, and so many of the casualties in this conflict. Now, we can turn off the graph, by the way. Thank you very much. In this conflict, what's happened, and this is not an abstract idea, we've all tended to, I mean, it's very easy to see this as a kind of airy-fairy concept, but it has some very real, very serious flesh and blood consequences. Let me tell you a bit about my time in Afghanistan, which I think is very, very instructive. I was a correspondent for the BBC back in 1995. And that was the time when the Taliban emerged from the southern areas of the country, and they laid siege to Kabul. Of course, the Taliban have since become emblematic of the conflict, the war on terror. They've been seen as the enemy. They've been seen as those who pose an existential threat to the West. They're the extremists and the terrorists. Back in 1995, we used to cross the front lines with impunity. We used to drive across, we used to sit down and have tea, we'd have lots of existential arguments with them. We didn't always agree with what they said. They certainly didn't agree or understand what we stood for or what we believed in. But as journalists, we weren't involved. We weren't a part of the conflict. We were observers. And so the Taliban tolerated us. In fact, both the governments and the Taliban encouraged our involvement. Governments wanted us because they felt that by covering what the Taliban was doing, we would help expose the hypocrisy, the lunacy, the craziness of some of their ideas. The Taliban, for their part, saw us as an opportunity also to express the way that they saw the world, and so we had a legitimate function on that battlefield. But after 9/11, I went back into that, to cover the war there, and a few things happened that I think at the time we didn't fully appreciate, but have since, to my mind, been seen as a real turning point in this conflict. We saw a group of journalists who were killed, about 4 of them, who were driving from Pakistan up to Kabul, including a very dear friend of mine and someone who I know has become quite a hero here in Italy, Marina Petrillo. One of the Taliban commanders who was convicted of murdering the 4 of them said that they were ordered to kill journalists by the Taliban leadership. They were explicitly ordered to go after journalists. Then there was a bomb attack by the United States. They dropped a bomb on the Al Jazeera bureau. Now, of course, the Americans said that it was a mistake. They said that Al Jazeera was never the intended target, although the incident has never properly been investigated. But there are many, many colleagues who are fairly convinced that one of the reasons that bomb fell on the Al Jazeera bureau was because Al Jazeera at the time had extraordinary access to Al-Qaeda and to Osama bin Laden. And then, of course, we also saw the kidnapping of Daniel Pearl, who was later beheaded by Al-Qaeda. all of these incidents were crucial changes because of the way that they targeted journalists, not because of anything that they were reporting, not because of anything that they had written in the past, but simply because of what they represented. I'm not suggesting for a moment, by the way, that there is a moral equivalence between the extremists who take the heads off people like James Foley, Stephen Sotlov, or Kenji Goto, as we saw with Islamic State in Syria. I'm not suggesting that governments, Western governments who are clamping down on, or any governments indeed, who are clamping down on journalists are exactly the same. But my point is that in this binary war, journalists who would normally be stuck in the middle are now being seen as legitimate targets by both sides. I think since the war on terror began, governments around the world have been using the T word as a way of excusing all manner of attacks on human rights and press freedoms. It feels almost like a kind of globalized McCarthyism. Of course, under McCarthyism, it was communism that was seen as the bogeyman and an excuse to clamp down on freedom of speech, on all sorts of human rights. Now, it's terrorism that's being used as that excuse. I don't want to minimize the risks of terrorism or blame governments alone, but this is the way that governments are using. They're redefining terrorism, expanding the definition of terrorism to include the kinds of things, the kinds of spaces that up until now would have been vehemently opposed by freedom of speech advocates, by the press themselves, by human rights advocates. As we heard in the introduction, this is not a hypothetical problem. This is something that happened to me and my colleagues in Egypt. This is deeply personal. Last year I came out of 400 days in an Egyptian prison. As we've heard, we were convicted for collaborating with Islamic extremists, of terrorists. And a prisoner often thought about what we'd done to upset the government. Now, I wouldn't have minded so much being in prison if we'd actually done something to push the limits, to push the boundaries. I've had lots of experience in Africa and the Middle East, across Latin America as a correspondent, and anyone who's worked in the field will know that once you've had a bit of time out there, your radar starts to get nicely tuned to the limits of what you can and can't say, about how far you can push things before you start to get the government nervous, before you start to get some kind of pushback. Well, in Egypt, that wasn't the case. I was there only for 2 weeks before our arrest. We were covering the unfolding political crisis in Egypt, the struggle between the remnants of the old regime, the Arab Spring revolutionaries, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And we were playing it very vanilla. I didn't know my way around it. I wasn't so deeply embedded in the story that I was comfortable pushing the limits, so we didn't. What we were doing, I think, was very ordinary, very pedestrian reporting. But the Egyptian government had redefined terrorism to include speaking to what, under normal circumstances, would have been considered as the political opposition. Remember, the Muslim Brotherhood, 6 months earlier, had been part of, or had been in power as the first legitimately elected government that Egypt had ever had. When we were there, they remained the single most organized, the single largest political force in the country. So as any responsible journalist would do, we sought out the voice of the opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood. That, in the view of the government, was enough to push us over the edge, was enough to define us as supporting terrorism. I think we're seeing a similar redefinition, not to the same extent by any stretch, but we are seeing a similar redefinition of terrorism to impose amongst Western governments to impose themselves on the space that journalists have traditionally been able to operate in. There are a lot of examples around the world, but I want to go into just one example in my own country that I think is illustrative. This is in Australia, a government or a country which broadly is seen as a bastion of freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Up in that map that we saw earlier, it is solid green. And yet a few years ago, the government wrote new legislation which allows the minister to declare any operation by the security services as a secret intelligence operation. It's what's called an SIO. Now, the thing about an SIO is that if a journalist or a source exposes any information about an SIO, you can be put in prison for 5 years. You can get 10 years for what they call aggravated disclosure. But here's the thing about an SIO. Because it's a secret intelligence operation, it is by definition secret. We will never know what has been designated an SIO. So think about the effect that has on reporters who are doing what I think is absolutely essential work in a democracy, and that's keeping track of the work that the security services are doing in the name of the people who elect the government, us the voters. We have a legitimate right and a responsibility to know what is being done in our names. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we should blow open secret intelligence operations for their own sake, that we should damage national security. But we also have a responsibility to know what is being done in our names. If you're a reporter trying to investigate the operations or keep track of what the security services are doing, and you're never going to know what's designated as an SIO, how are you supposed to operate? Here's something else about an SIO. It exists in perpetuity, forever. That designation, unless a minister specifically withdraws it, will always remain. So even if you're looking back at the history of the security services operations, unwittingly you can find yourself in prison. You will never know whether you've crossed the line until you wind up in court. Now, I don't have a problem with keeping our society safe. I don't, like most journalists, want to expose people to undue risk. But I think the existing safeguards have done a very good job of keeping security operations safe. I think that the professional standards that journalists have been operating under until now have done a very effective job. And so my argument is that we need to make sure that we defend the space that journalism operates in, particularly in the new environment, and particularly in this war on terror. Remember, the media is the fourth estate. It's the fourth pillar of a healthy functioning democracy, alongside the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And if you weaken any one of those, you destabilize the whole edifice. In my work in more authoritarian places, I've often noticed the relationship between the government and the media, there's a sliding scale. It defines the way that power is distributed. The more you move power from one side, the more you give it to the other. In the current environment, it's all too easy, too tempting for governments to use the war on terror, as I've mentioned, to drag the slider to the right, to take it away from the press, away from the media, and push it more towards the government. That's trading off the media's oversight role. And as I said, in my view, it's damaging the fundamental pillars of democracy that have helped keep our democracies the most stable, prosperous, and safe in the world. But even if we wanted to live in a police state, I think history suggests that we can never really do that and still deal with terrorism. That perversely, the best way to tackle extremism of any sort is to keep an open, accountable society with a media that's free to do its job, interrogating not just governments, but those whose opinions tend to drift off into the political extremes. Now, here's the point that I really want to get to. Over the course of this festival, I've been struck by the amount of stress that journalists everywhere seem to be under. We all know people who've lost their jobs. I dare say there are plenty of people in this room who are afraid of losing theirs fairly soon. And I feel very sorry, I have to admit, to those students who are here who are keen to get involved in this business. Our businesses are under assault from the digital revolution. The business models have collapsed, and I've yet to see any convincing model which is emerging to save journalism for its own sake. But here's the thing. Amongst all of the stress and angst around adapting to the new digital environment, I think we're failing to make a collective case for our own role in democracies. We've got to remind both our audiences and our political leaders that a free, robust and healthy media is a fundamental reason why the democracies have worked so well. So my appeal to you today, to all of us in this business, is to take every opportunity to make the case for media freedom, to push back whenever there seems to be a move to limit our work, to limit the work that we do, to set aside our competitive instincts for a while, and to join our friends and argue loudly and clearly about why we need to get on with the jobs as freely as possible. It was the French philosopher Albert Camus who said that a free press can, of course, be both a good thing and a bad thing, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Thanks.
Grazie Peter Greste, naturalmente, e anche se non lo vedo sono sicura che c'è qualcuno con un microfono pronto per qualunque domanda vogliate fare. Peter è più che felice di cominciare anche una discussione. Eccola là, bravissima. Io gli faccio una prima domanda, che è quella sulla visibilità della mobilitazione a favore della libertà di stampa. I'll just start with one question because I know there's already questions from the audience. It looks, especially on the way we live and share our experiences on social media now, it looks easier to mobilize for a specific case or specific cases against press freedoms than it is to mobilize ahead of that happening. For example, when legislation has been changed, we know for sure, as you said, that Egypt, and I think also Turkey, is actually engineering the law.
Yeah. This is something that concerns me. It's really interesting. I'm glad you raised that point because the campaign around our case, for example, was absolutely extraordinary. What I think our case did, I'm not sure how many of you remember the Free AJ Staff campaign, but it was, I think, one of the most successful campaigns on social media ever. Never mind about the media. The Free AJ Staff hashtag received 3 billion impressions. 3 billion, that's an absolutely phenomenal number by any measure. And we saw hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people tweeting about the case. We saw politicians talking about it, up to and including President Obama. And I think that's largely because we came to represent something that I think people had come to see in the abstract. We put faces and names to these very abstract concepts, and it became very easy for people to support us as individuals rather than the whole broad concept around press freedom. And the other problem is that when governments, as I mentioned in the presentation, when governments are talking about tightening up security, it's very, very difficult for news organizations to push back and say no, because we're talking about the security of individuals. When you've just had a massive terrorist incident, a bomb blast somewhere where there are bodies everywhere, it's incredibly emotional, and of course governments want to stand up and say that we have to protect our people, and to protect our people we need greater security provisions that control the space, that prevent terrorist ideology, for example, from being promoted. But the moment you start legislating around the disclosure of terrorist ideologies, the moment that you start placing restraints on the work that journalists can do in talking to the extremists to try both and understand what drives extremism, but also expose that kind of logic to public scrutiny and I think ridicule in a lot of cases. So when you're dealing with individual cases, you have something that's real and tangible. When you're dealing with broad legislation, it's often in the abstract. And I think that cuts to the core of why this is so difficult.
Yeah. I think we have already a question there. Prime domande? First questions? There's one down there and one here. Thanks.
Hi, I'll go first, I guess. My name's Julie Pizzetti. I'm an Australian journalist. Hello and welcome, Peter. It's fantastic to hear you here, there and everywhere talking about press freedom.
Thank you.
One of the things that comes up constantly, though, in the move to activate industry to support media freedom vociferously, as you've suggested we do here, is the issue of trust. That journalists now have such little credibility, particularly in Western democratic contexts, and news organisations are distrusted, that we have less effect in terms of galvanising community support for the kind of change that we saw in your case. Do you have any wisdom to share on that? How do we influence audiences who then influence the politicians to actually avoid the sort of catastrophic legislation that you've highlighted?
Look, I think this is a massive problem. I think the erosion of trust is twofold. I think part of it has come from the erosion or the fragmentation of the media market, where people can get their news from so many different sources. And as we've seen in a number of other sessions that I've been to at this conference, what tends to happen is a kind of, people tend to slip into silos, into digital silos, where they tend to hear only things within Twitter and Facebook and other social media sources that tend to conform or confirm their pre-existing beliefs. And so when they read something in traditional media which contradicts the other messages that they tend to be hearing from those sort of self-reinforcing loops, they tend to believe that they tend not to trust it, they tend to disbelieve it. And I think this has had a very serious effect on trust, on public confidence in the mainstream media. It disturbs me also, by the way, that the MSM as a set of letters has become an insult, particularly in the United States and elsewhere. And so I wish I had an easy solution for you. I'm afraid I just don't. My broad appeal, and when I've spoken about this before, I've said that one of the things that's incumbent on journalists is to hold to our professional standards fiercely and vehemently. We've seen an increasing trend towards populist-style journalism, to tabloid journalism, in a kind of rush to try and grab clicks, to try and hold on to our audiences. And I think ultimately what we're doing is degrading the very thing that has placed us at such a central part of society in the first place, and that is public confidence, public trust. That's not an immediate solution. This is a kind of very broad, very kind of nebulous way of trying to restore public confidence. I don't have an answer for that particular problem, but I want to take this opportunity to appeal to anyone who works in this business to stick vehemently to that. And I think this is not also an abstract issue. Let me talk about our own case, for example. The reason that we had so much public support was because people knew that they could trust our work. All of those of us in prison had always held, I'm very proud to say this, we'd always held to our highest ethical standards. And I know for a fact that we know that the Egyptians, if we'd done anything in our past, if we'd been shabby with our journalism, if we'd broadcast or published anything in the past that had been inaccurate or unfair or unreasonable, the authorities would have picked that up in a flash and they would have broadcast it all over the world. They'd have pumped it out on social media. And the effect of that would have been to undermine public confidence and political confidence in our own claims to be innocent. It would have cast doubt on whether or not we had actually been perhaps involved in some of the things that the Egyptians accused us of. So the reason that we had so much rock-solid public support was because the public and the politicians felt that they could trust us, that we hadn't done anything wrong. I think that's a really important lesson. And I think that this is, again, it might not come back to answering your own question in the very specific sense that you intend it, but I still think that the question of public trust and professional ethics is something that we cannot lose sight of.
No, can I speak? I wanted to know, what do you think about Assange and Snowden case? They are not journalists, perhaps. So.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I've struggled with this. The question was, what do we think of Assange, Julian Assange and Edward Snowden? My own view is that a mass data dump of the site we saw on WikiLeaks is not journalism. Responsible journalism is not just about exposing information for its own sake, of publishing data. Responsible journalism involves curating information. We all have professional ethical standards. We simply don't expose things for their own sake. We have to recognize that there are reasons why some things need to be kept secret. There are questions of privacy, there are questions of security. And so I have a problem with the kind of relatively unregulated data dump that we saw with both Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks. I think that what we've seen with the Panama Papers is a lot more responsible. They have massive amounts of data, but the data itself hasn't been exposed. It's been curated, it's been examined by journalists. They've gone through it very carefully and decided which information is in the public interest. And it's that public interest defense, that public interest test, which is so crucial. Is this information in the public interest, both in terms of public security, but also in terms of public interest, in the public's right to know what's being done in their names? Yes. Microphone down the front was. Oh. Sorry.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. You raised fundamental issue threatening our democracies. We live in a world where we are told to be, from the US, France, Tunisia, that we are in a war against terror. And we are all asked, from street vendors to teachers to journalists, to contribute to this war on terror in the name of our own security. This war on terror is also a war of information. And crossing the official narrative line means jail, torture, a bit as you have experienced yourself in Egypt. So I wanted to ask you if this war on terror, particularly in the Middle East, is not a dangerous avenue for our government to clamp down on freedom gained during the Arab Spring and the return of the authoritarian regime. Thank you.
Look, I think that really cuts to the core of what I was saying earlier, that I think, it's fine if governments want to call it the war on terror, and there are plenty of commentators who will stick to that, but I think in particular as journalists we have a responsibility to question it. That's what we do. We question and hold governments to account. We challenge the ideas and the premises that governments and politicians use to impose legislation, impose restrictions on us. I'm not suggesting, by the way, for a moment, that there isn't a legitimate problem, a legitimate conflict, or that public security is not at risk and that we need to take extra steps. What I am arguing for is, though, is to protect the media's role and responsibility to act as neutral interrogators of those decisions. Most Western democracies at the moment have fairly well-defined limits around the work that journalists are able to do, and those limits have worked very effectively up until now. We're seeing governments using the war on terror as an excuse to increase those limits. And because it's the war on terror, it's becoming much easier for those governments to impose those restrictions without pushback from civil society or from the press. There is some pushback, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I don't think we're seeing it anywhere near enough because of the public pressure to do something, to be seen to be doing something and responding to this. My main concern is that the war on terror is seeing an erosion of something that is absolutely fundamental to the way that democracies work and the reason things have been so successful until now. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thanks.
We still have 5 minutes.
He was not a journalist, but he died in Egypt, and so I want to know if you have something to say to Giulio Regeni, about Giulio Regeni.
Yeah, look, I'm afraid I don't know a great deal about his particular case. I do know that there have been some very serious questions raised by the Italian authorities around the Egyptian judicial system, the investigation that's been conducted. All I would say, I think, is that my own experience suggests that the Egyptian authorities have a great deal of work to do to demonstrate that they are actually following the rule of law. And it seems that the Italians remain unconvinced that they're doing that. I'm afraid beyond that I don't know enough about the specifics of the case. As you say, he wasn't a journalist, but clearly there are some very troubling aspects of that, which I think, given my own experience, I'm also very concerned about and troubled by.
Un'ultima domanda, abbiamo proprio i minuti giusti per un'altra domanda e un'altra risposta. One more question, one more answer, just the last one. There.
Hi, Al Jazeera is pursuing legal action against the Egyptian government, and I wondered if you had any hope for the outcome of any resolution or answers from the government over your case.
I think if you have a look at what happened to me and my colleagues, I was released on February the 1st last year after phenomenal international pressure. And I was released under a decree that was passed a couple of months earlier that gave the president the power to deport a foreign national to either serve out their sentence in the country of origin or to complete the judicial process. And that decree has come to be known as the Greste decree, which is something I'm not particularly proud of, but it was because I was the only person in the Egyptian judicial system that applied to. The reason I think that the government did that, released me and not my two colleagues at that point, and invoked that piece of legislation, or that decree, was to relieve the pressure off the government's back. We went through the retrial. I was convicted in the retrial along with my two colleagues who were sentenced again. We were sentenced to 3 years once again. My colleague Mohammed Beher Mohammed was convicted to an extra 6 months, 3 years and 6 months. They were in prison for another, I think about 3 or 4 weeks before they were finally pardoned and released. But the pardon didn't extend to me. I remain a convicted terrorist with an outstanding prison sentence. And the reason I'm telling you this is because in both cases, the Egyptian authorities, to my mind, did what they had to do to relieve the pressure, to relieve the international pressure off them. My colleagues have been pardoned. They don't have a prison sentence hanging over their heads. I do, and some 6 or 7 other journalists who were also convicted in absentia in the first trial also have outstanding prison sentences. So the pardons were not about achieving justice, they were about relieving the pressure. The pressure has now gone off the Egyptian authorities, and I don't think the Egyptian authorities will take any further steps simply because there isn't the pressure. As I said, this is not about justice, it was about political pressure. So the answer is I'm not really hopeful for any development, any shift, any kind of release.
I think our time is over, but I just would like to add a few words. Watch out for people whose reputation is being smeared, even the small local radio being attacked in any way, because sometimes the space starts shrinking from very, very little things before we realize it has shrunk to death. I remember one episode that I think we were all guilty of neglecting far before you guys were arrested, which was the shutting down of the offices of Al Jazeera Mubashir, the local Al Jazeera. There was no outcry, and I think some of the price for that was what happened to you guys. I wish you all the best, Peter Greste. It was great to have him at Perugia Festival.
Thank you.